Prime Minister, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Leigh. Good to be here.
Voters expect governments to manage the economy well. That's why we elect you. That is a given. Assuming that you meet that basic expectation and setting aside part one of your income tax plan, what would be the point of a Morrison government for the next 3 years?
Well, you're right. It is a choice. There's a choice between two different ways forward at this. And our plan sets out 1.25 million new jobs for the next 5 years. It means lower taxes for family and small businesses. We've brought the budget back into surplus next year, and to keep it in surplus and pay down Labor's debt, to invest in the schools and the hospitals and the roads at record levels. We've already increased hospital funding by over 60%, already increased public schools funding by over 60%, and that will continue into the future. Investing in the pharmaceutical benefits scheme, already 2,000 medicines listed and more to come in the future. Investing in taking on the challenge of youth suicide in this country with over a $500 million investment, expanding our Headspace network and skilling up Australians through our apprenticeships program. All of this while keeping Australians safe and keeping Australians' borders secure. Now, all of that is achieved because of a strong economy, and I'd say that not all governments do manage the economy well, and not all governments do manage budgets well. That's why managing the economy well and managing your finances well is so critical to everything else.
I want to pick you up on a couple of points there. A key issue in any election is trust. You spoke there about the budget being back in black. Will you be honest with Australian voters and establish a basic fact for them, which is that according to the budget papers, the budget is currently in deficit and a surplus is forecast for next year?
The budget for 2019-20 will be in surplus.
We are in 2018-19.
In 2018-19, which is the budget I handed down last year, that is improved by $10 billion over the course of the year, and
that's
this year we'll have a deficit.
That's the year that we're living in right now. So right now we are in deficit.
Yeah, but the budget you hand down each year is for the following year. So when I stand up and when I was a treasurer, you would hand down the budget for the following year, and the 2019-20 budget will be in surplus.
But my point is, we just have to square with voters. Right now, as we walk and breathe on this day in May 2019, the budget is in deficit. There is a projected surplus for the next financial year.
The accounts, as right now, are still in deficit, and next year they go into surplus, and it's taken us 12 years to get there.
Another thing you said in your first answer, you referred to Labor's debt. The coalition has doubled the size of net debt since it's been in office. It's not Labor's debt.
Well, no, it is, because that's what set us on the course to that debt, Leigh. And if you let me finish, what I'm going to say is this. We have been turning the budget round now for the last 5.5 years.
Net debt's doubled.
Yeah, I know, because we've been in deficit. And debt goes up when you're in deficit. And it's taken us all this time to get the budget back structurally into a position of surplus for next year, which is when you can start paying down debt. Now, debt will go down by $50 billion over the next 4 years. You can't pay down debt if you don't get the budget back into surplus. And so having got the budget back into surplus for next year, then we can move to the second phase of the plan, and that is to pay down the debt. But if it weren't for the reckless spending of the government previously, when Labor were in, that set that spending and baked it in for the next decade, which we've been getting under control for the last 5.5 years to reduce spending growth down to 1.9%, the lowest level of spending. I haven't finished yet.
I'm sorry, but
I haven't finished yet.
No, but I want to pick you up as we go, because you just said, you talked about getting spending under control. Labor's spending during its term was on average just under 25% of GDP. Yours is just over 25% of GDP.
Spending growth.
I'm talking about spending overall as a percentage of GDP.
And our spending growth falls below 25% of GDP. Our actual spending as a share of the economy falls below 25% of GDP. Our spending growth has fallen to 1.9%. That's been our average, and that is the slowest growth in expenditure of any government in over 50 years, even slower than when the Howard Costello government was in, which was around about 3.3%. So when we came to office, gross debt was rising at 30% a year.
On your point about spending growth, your 10-year plan claims to be able to cut income tax by $300 billion, but also spend $100 billion on infrastructure, while returning to a continuous surplus and eliminating net debt, all predicated on best-case scenario forecasts of historically low spending growth and no serious downturn. What Australian voter could possibly believe in such a rosy scenario?
Well, the Secretary of Finance and the Secretary of Treasury set out in the pre-election fiscal outlook exactly the accounts as the budget sets out, and that is that we're able to achieve our income tax reductions and our tax reductions for small and family businesses without cutting those expenditures in the future. And that document, which is the rule, which sets out what the facts are when it comes to the forward status of the budget over the medium term and over the short term and the budget cycle, All of that is set out in those documents, all signed off independently by the Secretary of Finance and the Secretary of Treasury.
But the budget papers themselves are warning of significant downside risks. Tomorrow we have a situation where the Reserve Bank is considering cutting interest rates. If the Reserve Bank does do that tomorrow, it will be a sign that the economy is not going that well, won't it?
Well, Leigh, you're right to point out that there are very real risks in the global economy over the next 5 years, and particularly the tensions between the United States and China. So you're right.
But all of what you're saying is predicated, though, on a very rosy scenario that, as you point out, is not necessarily what's going to come
The assumption of the budget is set out clearly and confirmed by the Secretary of Treasury and Finance. But my point is this: now is not the time for record spending growth. I mean, Labor are promising to spend 30 times more than the government in this campaign alone.
But they have
and they're going to
revenue-raising
increase
measures.
taxes by $387 billion over the next 10 years. Now is not the time to engage in big spending programs, big tax increases, because that equals big risk at a time of great uncertainty. Now, we're proposing a much more responsible approach, responsibly increasing support for hospitals and schools and roads. You're right, there is $100 billion of investment in infrastructure. When I was Treasurer, one of the key pieces of advice I got from the Governor of the Reserve Bank as we were going through a difficult period coming off the back of the mining investment boom was spend on infrastructure. And we have, and that has supported growth, and particularly in jobs, the highest level of jobs growth in a particular year the country's ever seen.
Does the Coalition really think that promising voters $1,000 this year will persuade them to re-elect a government whose track record includes dumping 2 Prime Ministers and whose future reform plan has little to it beyond income tax cuts that mostly land after 2 elections?
No, I don't agree with you on that at all, Leigh. First of all, we're a government that has delivered 1.3 million jobs, 100,000 jobs for young people in one financial year alone, the biggest growth in youth jobs the country has ever seen. We're the government that actually has reduced taxes for Australians and legislated it. We're the government that has listed 2,000 medicines on the pharmaceutical benefits scheme. 2,000, and Labor had to stop listing medicines because they ran out of money. We're the government that has taken defence spending and will in the future to 2% of GDP, restoring it from 1.56% under Labor where they left it. So that sounds like a pretty big agenda and a pretty big set of deliveries that we will continue into the future.
Prime Minister, if that is a pretty big set of deliveries, it brings us back to a fundamental question, which is if the Coalition has such a strong track record, why a matter of months ago did you need to dump the Prime Minister? Well,
that's a matter of record and history now, Leigh, and the choice of this election...
I think that's a key question that hasn't really been answered. If your record is as good as you say, why did you have to dump a Prime Minister?
Well, Leigh, the previous Prime Minister, Mr Turnbull, lost the confidence of the Liberal Party room and they changed Prime Ministers. And what I did when I became Prime Minister after that was to make sure that can't happen again. See, we're going into this election now where both parties have rightly changed their rules to ensure that sort of disruption doesn't happen in the future. So at this election, if you vote Liberal and National, you'll get me as Prime Minister for the next 3 years. And if you vote Labor or for any of the Labor candidates, you will get Bill Shorten as Prime Minister for the next 3 years. So I think that process, I didn't like it, but we fixed it. And so when we go to this election, I think voters do have a clear choice and can have confidence that the Prime Minister they elect is the Prime Minister they'll have for the next 3 years.
We saw Paul Keating, Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard come together at the Labor campaign launch on the weekend. Will you be having John Howard, Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull at yours?
Well, first of all, what that reminded me of when particularly Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd were there, I mean, Labor is proposing big spending initiatives at this election.
But
and what I
remember
remember from those 2 Prime Ministers, when they did their big spending, it always cost more because their implementation on pink bats and school halls and cash for clunkers and border blowouts. This is a reminder, I think, to everyone of the failures of that government.
But Prime Minister,
my launch on Sunday is going to be different.
Will you have those 3 leaders?
My launch on Sunday is going to be different. It's not going to be a party hoopla event. It's not about the Liberal Party. It's not about the National Party. Labor's launch on the weekend, I thought, was very much about the Labor Party. I just want to have a conversation with people on Sunday directly about the choice. It's not about who's coming. It's about who will be listening and my opportunity to set out to them once again the choice at this election.
Can we establish another basic fact for voters? Since the Coalition was elected in 2013, carbon emissions in Australia have been generally overall rising.
Yeah, they have lifted, and we've also made sure, though, Leigh, that we will be meeting and, in fact, exceeding the Kyoto 2020 targets that we inherited. And over that same time, I can also tell you that there have been 2.1 million extra solar panels put on roofs in this country, and we now have 1 in 5 homes which have solar panels on their roof, which is the highest level per capita in the world today.
But you point out that emissions have been trending upwards during your time in government. Therefore, why would voters trust you with another term in government to do something about that?
Because our commitment is to meet the targets that we set internationally. There are the Kyoto 2020 targets, and we will meet those. See, when we set a target, Leigh, we'll meet it. We've set a target for 2030 and we'll meet it. And that's why we had $11 billion in renewable investment come in 2017. That was the third highest per capita in the world. And we have $25 billion of renewable energy investment out to 2020. Now, that is a significant level of investment coming into this country for renewable energy, and that's all happened under our policies.
On this point, Prime Minister, of meeting targets, if we do meet our Kyoto 2020 targets, though, it is not due overall to coalition policy. The coalition's direct action policy has played a part in it, but there are also factors coming into play, such as credits which have come from during that Kyoto period when Labor was in office, which was to do with Labor's carbon tax, and also the closure of big coal-fire powered stations. The coalition can't take credit for meeting Kyoto 2020 when your own policies have played only a small part in it.
There's been a 1.1 billion tonne turnaround in carbon emissions reduction since we were elected to meet the Kyoto 2020 targets, and our policies have played a role in all of that, Leigh. But my point is simply this: renewable investments have been increasing. We're meeting the Kyoto targets that were set out for us, set by Labor, and we've made sure we were going to meet them, and in fact we'll exceed them by 369 million tonnes. And our budget for carbon emissions reduction out to 2030, based on the rules that are set out, the global rules for emissions reduction to meet our 2030 targets, we will meet, and we've set out the policies to achieve that. And the cost of that is $3.5 billion to the budget, and that will extend out over the next 10 years, and there is no additional cost to the economy.
In the greater scheme of the Australian budget, $3.5 billion is really very little over 10 years.
Well, I think any amount of money you're spending, I always spend carefully, Leigh, but that $3.5 billion investment, which is everything from the Climate Solutions Fund, which is purchasing abatement of carbon at the lowest possible price through the reverse auction process. It's investing in business energy efficiency in enterprises themselves and refrigeration. It's investing in Snowy 2.0 and the Marinus Link. That's the interconnector between Tasmania and the mainland, which will unlock a major investment in the Battery of the Nation hydro projects in Tasmania. That's what we're doing. That's how we meet our targets. Now, there's a difference. I accept, Leigh, that there's a difference between the emissions reduction target that we're putting forward at this election, which doesn't choose between the economy and environment, it chooses both, and what the Labor Party is proposing, which is 45%.
But on what you're doing, again, to come back to the issue of trust, John Howard said in office he'd act on climate change. He later admitted he was a climate sceptic. Tony Abbott, the same. The party's dumped Malcolm Turnbull twice as leader over climate and energy policy. You famously took a lump of coal into the parliament. Businesses decried the absence of a cohesive, committed climate and energy policy over the past 6 years. Given all those facts, why would voters trust a third-term coalition government to do anything differently?
Yet we meet our Kyoto 20 targets, we have policies to meet our 2030 targets, yet we have the third highest per capita investment in renewables in Australia in a year. We've got 2.1 million more panels on people's roofs, all achieved under the policies and our tenure in government. So those facts, I think, Leigh, speak to those issues largely being matters of commentary, whereas when you go to our actions and our achievements, we have been taking action on climate change. We've been getting action on climate change. We are meeting our targets, and we are drawing investment into renewable energy in this country at a rate that has never been seen before.
When your tax plan is fully operational after 2024-25, how much will somebody earning $200,000 a year save on their tax bill compared to today?
Well, they'll be paying the 45% tax rate, and that's around about $11,000.
So how is it fair that you're delivering to somebody on that income $11,000 a year, but somebody on a median income will only get about $1,400 a year back?
Well, someone earning about $45,000 that year will be paying about $5,500 on tax. Someone earning $200,000 will be paying about $55,000 in tax. So someone on a higher rate is paying 10 times the amount of tax on someone on a lower rate. But we're not changing the top rate of tax. The top rate of tax is unchanged. It'll be at 45 cents in the dollar. The big change we're making, Leigh, is to drop the 32.5 cent rate down to 30 cents, that impacts on 9.2 million Australians.
But
9.2 million.
But the person on the $200,000 a year can afford to pay the extra $11,000 on tax in a way that the person on the much lower income finds it much harder to meet that imposition.
That's why they pay 10 times the amount of tax, and that's why their average tax rate is around double what someone earning $45,000 or $50,000 is. That's how the way the progressive tax system works. At the end of our tax plan, Leigh, the share of income tax revenue that is paid by people on the highest rate of tax will be 36%. It is currently 31%. So after all of our changes, which is providing immediate relief to those now on low and middle incomes, and we're spending $15 billion on that, then we're lifting the 37,000 threshold will go up to 41 and then to 45. So that's not a lot of income. That's costing $48 billion. And then there's $95 billion to reduce that 32.5 cents, which is not the top tax rate. It's the second top tax rate that will be paid by 9.2 million Australians. That's going to come from 32.5 cents down to 30 cents. Now, I call that tax reform.
The National Party's done a preference deal with Pauline Hanson's One Nation. Why is the coalition normalising the values and activities of the far right in Australia? Well,
that's a matter for the National Party. We're two separate parties.
Well, the Nationals are your partner in government.
Yeah, and we work on things together in government, but as political parties, we make our own separate decisions about political matters.
Have you expressed any dissatisfaction to them about that deal?
No, I respect the National Party to make their own decisions, and they can explain those decisions themselves.
The Liberal Party's done a preference deal with Clive Palmer. Does it tell voters something about coalition principles that you'll do deals with Pauline Hanson or Clive Palmer if it helps you stay in power?
Well, once you vote Liberal and National, the choices after that get pretty thin. I wouldn't describe them as perfect. And under our compulsory preferential system, we have to advocate a valid vote of numbering all the squares.
But my point is, what does it say about my point is, what does it say about your principles if you're prepared to do deals with those kind of people to stay in power?
Well, it says that, do I think the United Australian Party is a bigger risk to the Australian economy and jobs in Australia's future than the Labor Party and the Greens? No, I don't think they're a bigger risk. I think Bill Shorten and the Greens are a much greater risk to people's jobs and the economic security and national security of this country than the alternative.
But to be fair, if you look at Bill Shorten's policies or Richard Di Natale's policies, whether you agree with them or not, they are at least, for example, based in science, based in evidence. They're not racists. They're not constantly dropping candidates in disgrace for offensive statements and behaviour.
Richard Di Natale thinks it's okay for people to invade farms. So I don't think that's terribly sensible. Richard Di Natale supports death taxes. I don't think that's particularly sensible. Richard Di Natale wants a 100% renewable target, which will basically crash our economy. I don't think that's sensible at all.
If coalition preferences help Clive Palmer or One Nation MPs into the Senate, how will that be a good thing for Australia?
We're advocating, again, you've got to number all the spots on the ticket, and we're advocating a vote for the Liberals and the Nationals. And after that, people will ultimately make up their mind where they put their preferences. And we've put the United Australia Party ahead of the Labor Party and ahead of the Greens.
And in doing that deal, have the Liberals had to offer anything in government? Okay.
Absolutely nothing. See, because remember, it was the Labor Party that voted against getting taxes down. It was the Labor Party who voted against increasing and didn't support, we had to drag them to the table, of increasing the small business definition from 2 million to 10 million. They didn't want businesses having 6 million in turnover to get access to the instant asset write-off, the 25% tax rate. I mean, that's what the last election was about. We had to ensure we defeated Labor at the last election to get small businesses' taxes down. They opposed us. They didn't want it to happen.
Who'll have the upper hand in driving Liberal Party policy if you're re-elected? The climate change sceptics who killed the National Energy Guarantee, voted against same-sex marriage and orchestrated Malcolm Turnbull's downfall, or the mainstream of the party?
I will.
Scott Morrison, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks very much.